Dear friends and colleagues, students and guests, dear participants in this workshop, dear Professor Wohlen, Director of the Kunstbibliothek, host of this workshop, and landlord, so to speak, of this venue, which is perfect for our purpose. I want to heartily welcome everybody showing interest in this workshop, especially those of our guests who are experts in the field of Latin American studies and Latin American art history, who took the trouble to get here. As you have seen in the program, most of them accepted the role of respondent, a role that is supposedly a minor one, but is in fact a crucial one for the purpose of this workshop. Dear Susanne Klengel, dear Jens Andermann, dear Sabit Buchmann, dear Michael Asbury, thank you for the understanding of this and for complying with it. In the same way as there are supposedly minor roles that are in fact crucial, there are supposedly major roles that are in fact crucial as well. I'm talking about the role of the keynote speaker. Thank you, Roger Bürgel, for accepting this role. The topic of your talk is concerned with the production and the representation of knowledge, and the production of knowledge about such representations. This topic is a perfect one for the purpose of a keynote to this workshop. Last not least, I have to and want to mention the fact that we are not only give and listen to talks in order to discuss them, but are also showing films about Helioitistica and films by Andreas Valentin, who made these film screenings possible. Thank you, Andreas, for this. If one is interested in an encounter with cultural situations, artistic ideas, social conditions, past and present, in other locations on the globe, locations outside Europe, film is a most helpful device, especially the films of those who are engaged in giving testimony to such situations and thereby point to the possibility of cultural contact and exchange. What is an issue here in this workshop is the notion of cultural difference. It's a somewhat tricky notion, since the perception of cultural difference will be different due to cultural difference. So once the notion of cultural difference is established in some way, it seems it can only produce more cultural difference, and this perhaps in a way nobody is really all too conscious about. There is a possibility of attempts to negate cultural difference, to produce some kind of overblown discourse in order to suggest some kind of hyperbolic identity that seemingly encompasses any notion of cultural difference. And there is a possibility of mere indifference. Indifference can have many faces. It can be the indifference of simple ignorance. It can also be a cynical ignorance. If the attitude, for instance, is, let the capitalist world order produce and reproduce the hegemonic structures that are an inescapable part of it, then cultural difference doesn't matter anyway, because any notion of it is immediately cycled back and calculated in terms of a dominant force. And there's the indifference of positivistic scientific knowledge as applied to cultural phenomena. Such a knowledge production uses neutralizing accounts that might be able to register cultural difference, for instance, statistically. But by the very means of knowledge production, have a neutralizing effect. Such knowledge production might be necessary in various respects, but is valid only if the information that is derived from the data is not taken as pure information, but related to the question of interpretation and therefore the question of meaning. We know that knowledge has a social structure. There is no pure knowledge, but different social structures and cultural situations. What we are engaged in is therefore a dialogue. A dialogue is not just an exchange of information. A dialogue is also not just any kind of interaction. A dialogue is only possible if the meanings that others produce are meaningful for us and vice versa, and if the communication of meanings becomes meaningful by itself. It can only be based on reciprocal appreciation. That's why we titled this workshop Brazil in Dialogue. This workshop was organized by the DFG unit Transcultural Negotiations in the ambits of art, comparative perspectives on historical contexts and contemporary constellations, that was established in 2011 at the Institute of Art History at the Freie Universität Berlin. It was set up by the combined efforts, this workshop was set up by the combined efforts of many persons having in common an enthusiastic interest in Brazilian art and culture, an interest in the interplay between Brazilian and European culture, an interest in the historical developments of this interplay, and therefore an interest in dealing on a theoretical level with questions concerning transcultural encounters in general. I have to explain this a bit. The research unit and its general theme is a frame of reference of various projects. It is partitioned into 3 historical timeframes from the Middle Ages to the present. There is one project that is directed by myself, by me, which is titled World Art and Art World Then and Now. This project is divided into 2 sub-projects. One of these sub-projects is dealing with the question when and how avant-gardes emerged outside the Western world, outside Europe and North America. This sub-project is divided into 2 geographical and cultural points of interest: the development of avant-garde art in Japan and the development of avant-garde art in Brazil. This is to say, in regard of the research unit as a whole, and even in regard to the project that is directed by me, this workshop reflects only a small portion of its scope, just a tiny bit, so to speak. But on the other hand, there are graduate students and doctorate students at the Department of Art History who do intense research on Brazilian art. Most of them are not officially part of the research unit, because once such a unit is set up and a predefined number of positions are filled with adequate candidates, there is not the possibility to create new positions within the same research unit. The purpose of such a research unit, however, is to have a certain impact on art history studies in general, to open new perspectives, and therefore I think it is a good idea to use the format of a workshop to bring together members of the research unit, international experts, and graduate and doctorate students who are not part of the research unit but do intense research on related topics. A bridge between these various groups of people are international scholars who are associated with the research unit. There are 2 right now, without whom this workshop probably would not have been possible, at least not in the way it is. There is Professor Andreas Valentin from Rio de Janeiro, who has a sabbatical that he spends in Berlin associated with a research group, but is also in contact with my graduate student and doctorate students. And there's Dr. Susanne Neubauer, who has a position that is funded by the DFG and is associated with the research unit. Her project complements the perspective of the project within the research unit that is directed by me, since she is focusing on the reception of Brazilian art in Germany and Switzerland. I am mentioning all this in order to point to the fact that Latin American art is still not a regular part of the curriculum of institutes of art history in Germany and probably in Europe on the whole. It still needs special research units in order to break up traditional Eurocentristic concepts of art history. It still needs graduate students, doctorate students, and postdocs who make it clear that they want to go beyond such concepts in their research. And it still needs workshops like this one. Such workshops, however, will be needed anyway, even when traditional Eurocentristic concepts of art history are overcome. Therefore, this conference is set up in the spirit that such a situation can be reached. Before I hand over the microphone to Roger Bürgel, I want to thank really all, who have contributed in whatever way and will contribute in whatever way to this workshop in order to make it a successful one for any participant, speakers, and listeners alike. I also want to thank the Museum für Fotografie for offering this space to us. It enabled us to set up this workshop outside the spatially somewhat constrained conditions we would have met in the buildings of the Freie Universität Berlin. Thank you very much. But now I want to introduce Roger Martin Bürgel to you. He's a curator, critic, and lecturer. He was the artistic director of the 2007 documenta 12 in Kassel. As you might remember, One of the main themes of this documentary was a migration of form, which has a lot to do with the things we are going to discuss, especially if one implies the other theme, the forms of migration. Roger Bürgel was also visiting professor for art history at the Kunstakademie Karlsruhe for 2 years, 2007 to 2009. Currently, he's the director of the Johann Jacobs Museum in Zurich, a former coffee museum, which Bürgel converted into a place to exhibit the history of global trade routes, and its cultural implications. In 2014, he reinstalled the Museum of Popular Art that the Brazilian-Italian architect Lino Bobardi had gathered in 1963 in order to give an account of the northeastern Brazilian culture. Roger Bürgel's presentation today will deal with some of his experiences during the research for and the installation of this exhibition. Thank you, Roger Bürgel, for being with us.